You're listening to a 3CR podcast of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia.
Radio MMT respectfully acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land from which we are broadcasting, the Wurundjeri people, and we are broadcasting to the Kulin Nations. Our focus is economics, that is, how stuff is produced and distributed. We recognise that for many tens of thousands of years, First Nations people's connection to country successfully embodied the world's oldest continuous economy, which was catastrophically disrupted by genocide and displacement. We acknowledge that we have much to learn to reshape our current extractive and exploitive system to achieve sustainable prosperity for everyone.
Radio MMT. Economics for the rest of us with Anne
and Kev.
Radio MMT.
Looking at the world through the lens of modern monetary theory.
Radio MMT. Macroeconomics for a well-being economy.
Macroeconomics? Isn't that incredibly boring?
No, Kevin, it's incredibly interesting. It's all about who gets what and why.
Who gets what and why? Okay, I'm in.
RadioMMT@gmail.com.
Incredibly interesting macroeconomics for the rest of us. Welcome to yet another episode of Radio MMT. How are you this week, Anne?
Oh, I'm great, Kevin, and hello to our lovely listener. Thank you for joining us as we head on down that path called the macroeconomy. I don't know why you keep saying yet another, Kevin. It sounds like it's an onerous thing.
Well, I'm expecting the revolution to happen any day.
Oh, I see.
Once the revolution occurs, we'll be out of a job because all this chat will be unnecessary. So,
Gotcha.
To me, MMT and our insights into the economy just seem so obvious that I can't understand why there hasn't been a massive social movement to change everything by now. It's long overdue. So that's why.
You can tell how the economists must be feeling by now. They've been repeating it ad nauseum for over 2 decades.
Yeah. Well, and we're going to go into some of that history when we continue our conversation with your good friend Owen, where we talk about such matters.
Indeed. So Owen Bennett is a founding member of the Australian Unemployed Workers Union, and he is a researcher on the history of trade unions and unemployment in Australia. And we had such a nice long conversation with him that we've edited over 2 episodes, so you can hear the previous episode where we spoke with Owen about how the current Labor government sells workers up the inflation river.
Yeah, well, coincidentally, from reading this book called The Hawke-Keating Hijack that was brought out in 1989, and it's a critique of the Labor government, but it also gives you a history of the Labor government. And what I'm learning from this book and what I'm hearing from Owen is that Labor has shifted its ground often. And it was mentioned by Lenin back in 1913 that the Labor Party was a liberal bourgeois party and not at all socialist. But then we find this kind of battle in the Labor Party where the socialists and the communists, and remember, that wasn't a dirty word back in the day. Remember,
to be a communist or a socialist.
Yeah. They were regarded as a philosophy. And I guess the demonisation of anything socialist or communist that occurred during the 1950s with that whole, Reds under the bed thing.
Yeah. So in Australia, you're saying that the Labor government have felt different pressures from different elements of the left. And that makes sense to me because the golden era, which came during the 40s, 50s, 60s, say, that wasn't the entire time that the Labor Party was around. So we could have had full employment in Australia before this golden era.
Yeah, well, this whole post-World War II period is kind of interesting because, remember, you've come out of half a century of turmoil, World War I, the Depression, World War II, and a lot of the soldiers and a lot of the people at home, when the war finished, there was this desire to have a stable life, for a calm, stable life. And so the Curtin and Chifley Prime Ministers organised this Coombs White Paper on full employment that was so kind of embedded in this stability that even Menzies had to abide by it, much against his will. And that lasted for 30 years.
Yes, so we will look at why the left abandoned the struggle for full employment at the end of this era we're talking about, and we'll look at how we reclaim the history of past successful struggles for full employment and what lessons we might take for our current time. So back to our chat with Owen Bennett.
And that goes back to a bit of my research on this, where that's kind of what happened in the post-war period, where there was really huge amounts of effort over decades and decades trying to build a genuine movement against unemployment, and it worked. That was part of the reason why full employment stuck around for so long after World War II.
Activism that was actually successful in gaining a full employment economy. I was going to ask you about that because we mentioned this golden age that was just post the World War II era. And we did have an unemployment rate of below 2% a lot of the time. But it seems like the received wisdom on what was going on there was that was because there was a whole lot of government spending going on with reconstruction after the war. So what would your take be on that story in that moment?
Well, I was really thrilled when I was doing my research because I didn't expect this. My research was on unions and unemployment broadly, and then I started looking at, well, hang on, what happened in the full employment period? What was the politics of unemployment like? And I was digging through a lot of communist literature, which is all available online. People who are interested in this can go have a look at that. It's on Trove. So the Tribune is the communist magazine. And I started looking at that and just searched unemployment, and all these articles started popping up of like huge campaigns that were being done by unions, most of them communist or communist linked, fighting for unemployment. And that probably comes as a bit of a surprise to listeners. You know, most people think, what can you do to fight unemployment? Like, this is something that governments do.
It's like a force of nature, like a natural disaster.
Yeah. And this is something that's quite new, in terms of, say, the post-war period, where workers felt like they had some kind of political, I suppose, avenue to influence economic policy after World War II through these movements. But these days, it seems like unemployment policy is something that happens to workers rather than something they have a hand in shaping through political action, through industrial action. So we need to remember those struggles because it's a reminder that these policies aren't set in stone. The mass unemployment policies that have been implemented for so long now, they're political products, and they're products of what's going on in the society, in the activist movements. So we need to start building those foundations for having meaningful struggle on this issue. And just to briefly go into what my research found is that yes, after World War II, there was a big push for full employment across the Western world, in the UK and Europe and Australia, and a lot of those countries successfully implemented full employment policies where unemployment basically averaged around 2%. A lot of those countries, not the US, interestingly, that was an exception, but the Soviet bloc was sort of showing that full employment was possible. There's lots of geopolitical kind of issues and also post-war construction and things like that. But just to cut the story short, once full employment was introduced, it wasn't something that was just a set and forget, which I think a lot of people, when they look at that period, they think, oh, it was a golden age because there was so much reconstruction happening, and that just sort of led to full employment happening. But the Menzies government, who was in power for most of that time, actually hated full employment. They didn't want anything to do with it, and behind closed doors, they would say this is bad because it's giving workers too much power, because when there's full employment, it means workers, they can basically say to the boss, well, if you're not going to pay me the acceptable rate, the going rate that the union's calling for, we're just going to go and get that going rate somewhere else. And the unions used that tactic really effectively in an organised way, where you had some shops where if they wouldn't pay the workers the proper rate, they would just leave en masse. and so that employer was stuffed.
Hard to imagine these days.
And that was a concerted strategy. I read some really amazing documents by leading unionists where they said we would just tap everyone on the shoulder and say we're out of here because they're not paying the going rate. So the bargaining power of workers was very, very strong, and obviously the Liberals and businesses hated that. So there was obviously political problems with that because full employment was wildly popular because it gave everyone that security. But Menzies still found a way to find excuses to undermine it, and that happened in three main occasions, which was the budgets of 1951, 1958 and 1961, those three modest unemployment crises where unemployment went over 2%. And everyone was tearing their hair out. Oh, unemployment was above 2% and approaching 3%. Like, that was considered a major crisis back then. And what the unions did, and led by a lot of these radical unionists in the Communist Party, is that they built these huge movements of struggle, fighting against what they saw as austerity policies. There was credit squeezes and all kinds of tactics used by the Menzies government to try to increase unemployment. And the radical left and unions just said, hang on a second, you can't do that. And they had these amazing rallies, like most famously, they got a couple thousand people to rally outside Canberra, Parliament House, state parliaments, and they had these amazing job actions as well and petitions to local members. They built a really strong political and industrial campaign for full employment, and they didn't rest until they got what they wanted.
Seems like the union leadership, if not the rank and file, were much more economically astute at that point, which was the understanding that government spending is directly related to levels of unemployment.
Yeah, I think that the key to it, and this is what I was really surprised by, the key was the Communist Party leading the way. So I think if it was left to the Labor Party itself, I don't think they would have taken this militant approach where they took every kind of extra parliamentary protest avenue available to them, and they used that as best they could. And it took a Communist Party to really lead people in that way, and the memory of the Great Depression, that all came to the fore. So the Communist Party had spent decades building foundations for these sorts of struggles, and when unemployment started to increase in 1951, for example, they started saying, the Depression's coming back again. We can't allow depression to come back. So they used the memory of the Depression and the horrors of that to galvanise the left broadly. So it wasn't just like a few groups here or there. They tried to bring in what was called the United Front, so broad movement pushing for full employment, and that happened when unemployment increased in 57, 58, and also 61. Every time unemployment went up, they started saying, this is another depression, because the government can decide the unemployment rate. They're deciding to increase it. We can't allow that to happen. They really framed unemployment in a totally different way to how we understand it. They framed it as a political choice.
The framing of unemployment, that is so important. And of course, we want to frame it as a structural issue, not as an individualised issue. In other words, we're trying to cut through that propaganda that tries to make unemployment look like it's an individual choice.
Like it's the fault of the unemployed. It's framed in a way that if you haven't got a job, it's because you're not employable. You need to be a better person.
Pull your socks up.
A better worker somehow. Not that there's no jobs available for you.
Exactly. In fact, I always say if you're unemployed, your personal circumstances will tell you partly why that is, because you might have moved towns recently or just finished up some study, or you might be facing an injury or sickness or just getting old. But if there is no job for you to go to, the reason for that is bad economic management by our federal government, is what I say. And, these structural issues, they were understood way back when, in the Keynesian era, in the 1930s. But I don't know, it just seems to keep getting forgotten and hidden all the time.
Well, the interesting thing about the Keynesian stuff is that, from 45 to 75, it was very much Keynesian economics, and that was part of the stabilisation of the world. And when that brand of economics hit the hurdle of the OPEC oil crisis, what happened was it got hijacked by the neoliberals, the Chicago School of Economics.
Back then, the monetarists. Yeah.
The monetarists, they came in, they said, see, your program doesn't work. Let's go back to how we used to do things. And that was all about profit-driven economics. And just imagine where we'd be if we'd evolved the more inclusive Keynesian style of economics to where we are now.
Yes. You wonder what the alternate history would look like, although I guess there would always be a backlash of some sort from the capital classes.
Well, there's always greedy bastards around. You've got to keep them in check,
And remember also, as well as Keynes, we've got the MMT perspective, which tells us that monetary systems create unemployment by design. That's the whole point of a monetary system. In other words, you have a central authority like the Australian federal government, and they create a tax system declaring that you have to get Australian dollars to pay your taxes or something terrible might happen to you. And so now you're looking for work to get the dollars. And what do you call people looking for work? You call them unemployed. So that's the big insight offered by MMT, that unemployment is, in a way, it's a feature of the system, not so much a bug, but it is the responsibility of the government to spend enough in order to have zero involuntary unemployment.
Yeah, just like they did in the post-war years, where the only unemployment was transitory unemployment. That was proper full employment, where anybody who wanted a job could find a job. But of course, the people who make profit don't like that. They like their workers to have a few options and have dire consequences unless they accept the terms and conditions that are presented to them.
Yeah. Also, just because we say the government is not spending enough, that doesn't mean that having the government just starting to spend willy-nilly is going to solve the issue. That's a little bit like what the Keynesian pump priming was doing. And so the other step forward that we get out of modern monetary theory is this idea that you introduce a job guarantee, which is where they guarantee you paid work at the minimum wage. And that's an improvement on the Keynesian idea, because that is a program that targets the unemployed workers. So there's no extraneous spending by the government that might cause inflation.
Yeah, expanding it past the concept of it being an employer of last resort, it also then benchmarks how your economy works. If you've got people working for, let's say, $50,000 a year on the job guarantee, that becomes the minimum wage. And every other wage then needs to be scaled according to what the job guarantee is.
And the reason the job guarantee becomes like the default minimum wages and conditions is obviously because anyone who's with an employer that pays less than that, they've got the option then to move over to a job guarantee, which means employers, to win their workers back, they're going to have to offer a bit more than the job guarantee.
And if the job guarantee pays you $50,000 a year for working 30 hours a week, well, then every other job has to scale its hours according to that. So the government then has a fair amount of control over how the rest of the economy might work, which is good if you've got a government that's on side. But I sometimes wonder what happens if you've got a government who's not on side and they start paying you $25,000 a year and expect you to work 50 hours a week.
80 hours a week.
Yeah. I'd be interested just to see what would happen to the gig economy, all the delivery drivers and Uber drivers and that sort of stuff.
They'll just fold.
Well, yes and no, because some people in that situation, and I'm thinking of retirees and students, don't really want to have a committed job. They want something which is flexible and will just give them a bit of pocket money.
Mm-hmm.
So there'd still be people who are willing to do that work, but they would be in short supply, so they'd be able to push their price up. And that's a good thing.
I have met the odd Uber retiree driving the Uber car and saying they're just doing it to get out there and meet people and earn a bit of extra income. So there are people who do want that flexibility, and unfortunately that idea of flexibility has been weaponized against the workforce. But you do wonder if they were able to bid up their prices, whether then customers would say, well, I'm not going to add $50 onto my hamburger to get it delivered anymore, or whatever it is.
Well, they might have to get off their fat ass and go get it themselves. I mean, yeah.
So let's go back to our conversation with Owen, and we're going to hear about one of the great battles over how we frame mass unemployment. And that, of course, is the way the mainstream economists use this concept of the NAIRU, the NAIRU, or the non-accelerating inflation rate of unemployment. And they frame mass unemployment as an unfortunate necessity. So it's not the problem of the individual, it's not government's not spending enough, it's just too bad, this is the way things have to be.
This framing of unemployment is an interesting topic, and it seems that there's two ways of viewing unemployed. There's the view from firms and from businesses, from employers, and there's the view from the unemployed. And it appears that the framing of unemployment at the moment is from the viewpoint of employers. That they use, the NAIRU, which we've talked about often on this show, and they say that this rate of unemployment that's required to keep inflation at a certain level. To me, I think that's code for if we keep unemployment at a certain level, we keep our profits at a certain level. Obviously, if there's downward pressure on wages, profits are more achievable. And it seems that the definition of unemployment has been captured from the wrong perspective. It's not representing the unemployed, it's representing firms, etc. And I've been just reading this book just recently, Bill and Warren's excellent venture, Bill Warren and
Bill Mitchell, the co-founders of modern monetary theory, aren't they?
And Warren Mosler writing about this, and they talk about a spending gap, and essentially they're saying that if the private sector isn't spending enough to maintain full employment, then it's the government's responsibility to fill that spending gap, to create activity to make sure that full employment is achieved. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you said it really well, that unemployment is viewed from the employer's perspective. And you have to ask why that is. Like, how has that been allowed to become the dominant way we think about unemployment? And that's the main finding of my research, was that the reason that has occurred is because the left have conceded so much ground on this area. There was that point where they were fighting for, full employment, fighting against unemployment, fighting for higher level of unemployment benefit, and all those sorts of things, framing it as a working class imperative that we have everyone able to get a job if they want one. And that changed. Like with the rise of the new left, they sort of started saying, actually, full employment may not be possible under capitalism. Maybe we should just go for broke for a socialist society. And that was seen really clearly after 75, when the Labor Party turned against full employment and introduced an austerity budget, the famous Hayden budget of 75, which was a shocking betrayal of the Labor movement. And that was when you'd expect the unions to go for broke, saying this is outrageous. But the biggest union at the time, the AMWU, which was communist-led, like these were the guys who had been fighting unemployment for 30 years, the whole full employment period, they came out and said, actually, full employment's not possible under capitalism. We need to fight the multinational corporations. So they withdrew from this fiscal policy discussion, and there hasn't been that much backlash to that.
They withdrew. Was that partly because they were dealing with an inflationary shock due to the increase in the price of oil? And no one really, I think, at the time understood what that was.
Yeah, that's right. So there was the stagflation crisis where you had unemployment going up and inflation going up, and everyone thought Keynesianism is dead. We got to start from scratch. We got to do something different. And what's really shocking to me is that all those labour radicals, the union radicals, the communist radicals, they all kind of bought that one way or the other. Obviously their conclusions were far different from the moderates who thought we need austerity. Their conclusion was we need socialism because capitalism can no longer facilitate full employment. But that was just wrong. Like there was plenty of countries who were subjected to the same economic pressures, like Sweden, that maintained full employment all through the 80s. And here you had people like Laurie Carmichael and other like big communist leaders, big union leaders saying, we can't maintain full employment under capitalism. We need to direct our campaigning resources against multinational corporations and trying to push for like a socialist transition, which was extremely strange strategy given, where the left was at that point. Like the Communist Party had been in decline for a long, long time. There wasn't a revolutionary situation happening. So it was a very dispiriting analysis where they thought the only real solution to this is socialism, but there was no like genuinely socialist possibility, I would say, in Australia in the mid-70s, and that's just kind of continued.
So they didn't see who has control over the fiscal levers, by which we mean the spending and taxing by the federal government. They sort of didn't see the importance of maintaining the struggle around how those levers are used.
Yeah, that talks to a broader problem that happened in the left, and there's a good book I'd encourage people to read called Reclaiming the State by Bill Mitchell and Thomas Farsi, where they talk about this in some depth. They say that the new left retreated from the state in these critical areas, and they thought that international capital was the target. And it was international capital that were pushing governments to adopt these policies of neoliberalism, etc. So they needed to attack the problem at its heart, which is, these forces of international capital. That's kind of the background to a lot of the anti-globalization rallies that were happening around 2000. And the left has really bought that hook, line and sinker.
I recall some graffiti from around that time. The halfpenny has no sense.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is they wanted to have a full-scale social revolution, move away from capitalism to socialism. So rather than tinker with the system that they thought couldn't work, they just wanted massive change.
Yeah.
So in contrast to that abandonment of the struggle to gain full employment, I'm just wondering, would you see full employment as central to the class struggle? And if so, why might it remain so concealed if it is central to the class struggle?
Yeah, I think it is so central because it is an area that a lot of people agree on. The idea that people should have the opportunity to work. It is a sort of a motherhood statement that people agree on. And this is why I think part of the reason why the Communist Party put so much focus on it. after World War II because it was a low-hanging fruit. People could get around it. Reformers could get around it. Labour Party people could get around it. Radicals could get around it. Everyone agreed on that idea. And I think it's only become more urgent when you start thinking about the climate situation and how central full employment has become to a lot of the demands of these Green New Deal and those sorts of issues. So it's just becoming more central as time goes by. This could be the rallying point, and we can start building a genuinely broad movement for progressive change. And that's the problem with a lot of radical campaigns, is that they're quite sectarian. So their issues they want are so narrow that you're not going to get broad public appeal. You're not going to get broad public acceptance of those ideas. And it's similar to what we're talking about in the mid-70s. That's what the left kind of became. It became this very sectarian movement pushing for these socialist ideas, which, while that's something I agree with, it's just not practical to build a movement around that. But full employment represented an idea that most people could agree with, and it just becomes a question of strategy. And we need to start introducing some more militant ideas of how we're going to make this a central core of left-wing thinking. There's room for everybody as well. Like, there's room for people inside the tent. Like, we're going to need people inside the labour movement to talk about this. We need people outside the tent to talk about it. It isn't like one of those things where, everyone has to be on the barricades. Like, no, we need to have all sorts of people pushing for this from all sorts of angles. And that's, I think, a really exciting thing about it.
Yeah, so it seems, Kevin, that another Owen strategy is this idea of a pincer movement. So rather than just whinging about Labor, we should look in the mirror and ask ourselves, do I want to operate inside the tent or outside the tent in this kind of pincer to get Labor shifting to where we might want them to go?
Yeah, this comes back to the malleability. Is that the right word for the shifting ground of the Labor Party, who really have distanced themselves from unions now. Like, unions have been disparaged in the same way that socialists and communists were, which is, again, a successful campaign by the Conservatives. And we really should look at the way they do things, because we could use the same strategies against them, I'm sure.
Yeah,
I've already started doing it. When anybody calls me a socialist, I call them a capo dog. I go, you call me a name, I'll call you a name. It's
that's the Kevin strategy. That's a great one.
But the Labor Party, truly a neoliberal light party now. They embrace neoliberal policies like the Nauru. I can't see how you can call yourself a Labor Party for the workers if you are prepared to purposely throw workers onto unemployment to increase profits for corporations. That to me is as neoliberal as you can get, which is probably why I'm not a member of the Labor Party anymore.
You might be outside the tent these days, Kevin.
Outside the tent. I was inside the tent for a while, and I was pushing these ideas and the rest of it. But yeah, no, Owen's right. It needs to come from many directions. There's strength in numbers. Imagine if all the workers of the world united. It'd be amazing. And now I'm a communist, So.
Well, first step, Kevin, we know through our understanding of modern monetary theory that full employment is definitely financially sustainable. And so the question is whether it's politically sustainable. So back to our chat with Owen Bennett.
You're with Anne and Kev on Radio MMT.
At 3CR Community Radio in Melbourne, Australia.
And wherever you get your podcasts.
Economics for the rest of us.
So are you willing to give us any hints of what starting to move the discussion might look like?
Well, I'm going to be sort of rattling on this for a long time, and we've been talking about coming up with a Unionists for a Job Guarantee group and trying to play our little role, a humble little role where we can. But I think we have to look to the example of international movements because they're far more advanced than us. So the climate kind of movement in America with the Green New Deal, like, they got pretty close to actually getting a Green New Deal in legislation. They almost got Biden to sign that. Like, the fact that they were that close, it says that there's a huge movement there that's putting pressure on the politicians. And in Europe, there's also a job guarantee group that's pushing hard on this. And those guys have a broad appeal. And there's academics, there's unionists, there's activists. They're all fighting that same battle. And that's what we need to start building in Australia, that broad coalition of groups that all should want to have a say in this. That's where, you need people from outside the traditional left who, for whatever reason, have these ideological hang-ups. You need to bring those guys in to start building that coalition.
Yeah, there's a whole range of people who can see the urgent need for these new ideas and this realistic approach to how you manage an economy. Just to play the devil's advocate, I did come across a 2016 paper titled Political Aspects of Buffer Stock Employment, and that was written by Peter Chrysler and Joseph Halevi. And of course, if we're talking about full employment, one of the key structures of that is the job guarantee that Kevin and I often talk about on this show. So there are people who will criticise a job guarantee as, I guess, what they would call a reformist change rather than a radical change, meaning that it cannot address the underlying power relations and therefore it doesn't take us any closer to socialism. And in this paper, they were asking, can the implementation of a job guarantee by itself change the dialectics of capitalist economies, reforming class relations so that full employment becomes permanently achievable? So I guess what they're worried about is that any kind of success in getting a job guarantee, that it could so easily be rolled back if you haven't addressed some of the underlying power issues. So how would you respond to that once you start campaigning around a job guarantee?
Yeah, it's a big issue that goes back a long, long time. It's worth thinking about what the radicals were talking about, after World War II. Like, there was this very famous economist called Mikhail Kalecki, and he talked about that a lot. He basically said that there is a political problem when it comes to full employment, which is how do we maintain this thing? Because there's going to be a huge backlash from employers. And the way that was interpreted by a lot of radicals was that maybe we should just be going straight for socialism because there's a strong possibility that full employment is not sustainable under capitalism. That I think, argument was disproven by what happened during the full employment period, because full employment was much more stable than most radicals thought it would be. It maintained for 3 decades, and it was maintained through strong political pressure. And I think that the broad appeal of it is because reformists could get around it because it was so effective in giving people a better life, but radicals could get around it too because it was a stepping stone to socialism. And I think that's a point that needs to be better understood, that by giving workers the right to work, that gives them greater power both industrially but also socially. It gives them a greater social power because they're more united, they're easier to organise, most of them will be in unions. So that gives them a stepping stone to start demanding greater socialist policies. Like, let's talk about the mid-70s, for example, which was where this all came to a head because all these economic conditions were introduced which made full employment very hard to maintain and give capital what it wanted. So capital and labour were kind of standing off over full employment. Capital was saying, we can't maintain full employment because our profit rates are going to get smashed. And labour was saying, we want to keep full employment. And this struggle should have been a potentially revolutionary struggle. It could have been a period where we could have maybe had a transition to a sort of a socialist society. I mean, just talking very abstractly, because if Labor stood by its guns and said, we're not going to accept anything else.
We're doing alternate history here now.
Yeah.
Yep.
And it really saddens me that the Communist Party and the AMWU and all these guys that have been fighting for full employment for so long and so effectively, they weren't there to fight that struggle. And they just sort of started stepping back from this really, really strong commitment to full employment in the late 60s. And if they didn't do that, if they, let's say, took a step toward it and even started organising more about it and increasing the vigilance of the working class to fight unemployment whenever it arose, that would have been a serious, serious struggle in the mid-70s. When unemployment hit 3-4%, Whitlam was in power saying that we've got no choice, there is no alternative, that whole Margaret Thatcher line. Mm-hmm. If you had a radical movement that would say we're not going to accept anything less, and back then there was 50% union membership, like, that's a huge movement that either it could have got the reform it wanted of full employment, like what happened in Sweden, or if capital were dead against providing that reform, it's like over our dead bodies, then that is a potential revolutionary situation where you've got an impasse. And that's what I mean where it's a pathway to socialism, because I think most leftists would agree that capitalists are never going to accept full employment long term, because these pressures get introduced every now and then where their profit rates take a hit and it doesn't become viable for them to run the business they want to run. That's when a revolutionary situation occurs where there's this impasse, and that's where we need to be, prepared.
Owen seems to be making the case that achieving full employment once again, it could sow the seeds for this revolutionary change, because if full employment came under attack again, then that might mobilise more people to stand up for their rights if they've already got this job guarantee.
And I guess the thing that Owen was saying was that there were far more politically involved people back in the day, the communists and the socialists, who would push these agendas, but they've been shoved into the background now.
Well, that was that thing about, you just mentioned this idea of communists seeing themselves fighting an international battle. And it's really interesting that how back in the 1970s, in that era of stagflation with the oil crisis, that the unions said, okay, well, what we really need to be doing is fighting this international battle against capital and globalization. And they really took their eyes off the prize in terms of the power of the state with what we call its fiscal levers, which is the power to create money when it spends and to tax money out of the economy.
I guess that's where we hope to influence people's opinions, influencing general discussion, etc. If they sort of gain momentum, then things do change, sometimes quickly, sometimes very, very slowly.
I feel like I'm a little ant pressing against the Overton window.
What's the Overton window? Explain it to me again. I've heard it.
It's the acceptable boundaries of public discussion and understanding.
Oh boy, I'm way outside that a lot of the time.
So we could just imagine this window getting bigger or shifting around to different kinds of ideas that are floating around.
So one thing I hear around the MMT circles and sort of down at the pub where Kev and I want to go is that if we're going to start campaigning, our focus really should be on full employment as a broad suite of policies rather than just honing in on a job guarantee. And I think the reasoning behind that is something to do with the economics in the way that Bill Mitchell describes it even, which is this idea that you don't want to reach full employment by shoving a whole lot of your workers onto a job guarantee, because that is just a minimum wage. And so what you really want to be doing is spending enough so that you've got a fully funded public service doing hopefully what we think you need to do in terms of getting through the climate crisis and the biodiversity crises and all those planetary boundary issues. And also a full employment economy would be properly training its workers and restoring and fixing the broken vocational education sector and the apprenticeship systems, which are things that we talked about with John Haley recently. So I guess it's a strategic question as to how big of a chunk of full employment do you bite off to campaign on?
Yeah, and I think this is typical of the left, where they're just kind of running around in circles a little bit and not focusing where they should be focusing, which is basically making the argument that the current status quo of mass unemployment is unacceptable.
Owen Bennett, researcher on the history of trade unions and unemployment in Australia.
All those questions of policy, they're important to have, but that's not going to sway an ordinary person about whether they're going to support this movement or not. That's not what's going to win the campaign, I don't think. But I think it's also worth saying, let's just look at the job guarantee, which is probably the most fleshed out policy proposal for full employment, recently. Let's say that was introduced today. Today there are 3.5 million people looking for work, let's say. So under a job guarantee, those 3.5 million people would be able to have work at a minimum wage. And that minimum wage, it's worth saying, is not just set at, kind of barely enough to live. Like the minimum wage today, I think it's about $40 40,000 or something like that. And that itself is contested. Like, that's a product of a political environment. So if workers don't think that minimum wage is acceptable, doesn't reflect what it takes to be included in society, then that becomes a product of struggle as well. So that there is no sort of set rate where you just have to accept crumbs they throw at you on the job guarantee, because that becomes a subject of political struggle. And the more people who are active in their union, who are on job guarantee, that's more organising, and that's more social capacity for demanding a more inclusive minimum wage. So that's why building that movement we've been talking about this entire time is so crucial, because the movement that fights for the job guarantee is also going to be there when it comes to fighting for a decent job guarantee.
Right.
And it's about giving people a say. People should have a say about what work they do. There's 3.5 million people who are looking for work, many of them totally isolated. But a job guarantee kind of brings those people together, and with an active movement, it energizes them, and it keeps them, politically active to the point where they can put pressure on government.
In that conversation with Owen, we did move into that territory where there's a bit of division on the left around the job guarantee, with some people saying that because it's paid at a fixed rate, and I would say it needs to be paid at a fixed rate because that's the mechanism for keeping down inflation by preventing a wage price spiral. Some people don't agree that you shouldn't be able to bargain up the rate of payment of a job guarantee. And I think Owen was making the point that if a job guarantee functions as the minimum wage, as we were saying before, it inevitably will, then you can move the struggle away from whether or not the job guarantee should be a fixed payment or not, and you move the struggle more towards what should the minimum wage be. And so I think that's his way of overcoming some of this division on the left.
The other thing with people who propose that a variable job guarantee might be a good idea are kind of missing the point. The job guarantee is not a career structure. It's a safety net. It's a far better safety net than unemployment benefits. But you might as well say, people on unemployment benefits should have variable unemployment benefits as well.
I think you've touched on a really important thing there, because the way I've been thinking about it, and tell me if you would agree or not, Kevin, is I think of the job guarantee as a bit of a hybrid, like it's a hybrid between what we might say is a real job and with social security or welfare. And so you do see people organising around, say, the rate of the aged pension or disability payments and so on, but it's not like they're collectively bargaining in the same way a trade union would. So I think you'd say, yeah, we definitely need to bring all those payments out of poverty levels, but on the one hand, we should definitely have those payments structured so that they meet whatever cost of living pressures there are. And also, if we have this welfare safety net at the same time that we have universal basic services like universal education, dental care, healthcare, then you're relying less on those monetary incomes to keep up your standard of living.
Yeah, and there's also the discussion about, do you still have an unemployment benefit if you have a job guarantee? Well, Bill would say no, because he's a hard ass, and we get that. But other people would say, well, yeah, but like it doesn't have to be much because there's a better alternative that they should be taking. But we're not going to let you starve, As you say, if you've got universal basic services,
yes,
then if somebody says, I am able to work but I'm not willing, I'd rather be destitute, well, then it's a question of how destitute should that person be.
And we could probably put a roof over their head and, feed and clothe people.
Yeah.
And I think the path of least resistance is just leave the unemployment benefit where it is, just keep it going, and it'll be about half the rate of a job guarantee.
It's already impoverished and below the poverty level. It's already disgustingly low. And
Let's return to our conversation with Owen Bennett.
I guess I would be saying from the very start that the level of payment of a job guarantee needs to be socially inclusive and at least at around that $40,000 mark, if not more. On the other hand, there is the policy wonk issue of the job guarantee being a price anchor, so that you don't want it just going up and up the way that you might be negotiating wages going up.
Yeah. And yeah, I think we really need to be careful about going down the rabbit hole on this issue and splitting. We saw this with the UBI, full employment discussion. It was like, this is great for the ruling class to have us arguing amongst ourselves about, there's the UBI people and there's the full employment people, and now there's the job guarantee people. It's very counterproductive. I think that's what's so great about this broad movement that we're talking about, is that you bring everyone together and you say, we agree on these basic principles, and there needs to be understanding that there's going to be policy complexities that need to be worked out, but we're nowhere near that point.
Right.
We need to nail the key arguments, and we need to do that as soon as possible and build that movement, build a little bit of optimism into the left, because there's just none of it on the unemployment issue. It's very dispiriting broadly, although there are these glimmers of hope that we've been talking about with the Tomorrow movement and the fact that the ACT are talking about they want full employment, and even the fact that the Labor Party, wiggled a little bit on the NAIRU, saying that we don't really support the NAIRU all that much. Like, these are really good starts, and we can use them as building blocks to build that broad, inclusive movement. And yeah, I think some people on the left maybe prefer to raise their own little issue.
Are you saying that people on the left argue and have disagreements?
Actually think through issues.
It's worth mentioning an article I saw recently by Michael Hiscox. He's someone in Canberra who's quite a senior figure there, and he compared the job guarantee to work for the dole. That's just so destructive. Like, work for the dole is one of the most punitive programs this country's ever seen.
Right.
And to compare that to a job guarantee which is set at the minimum wage, which is providing people with this opportunity to work and contribute and do jobs that are decent jobs, all that sort of stuff. And for someone using his platform on the left as a senior union person to poo-poo the whole thing as work for the dole, that's just playing right into the ruling class's hands.
So with the job guarantee, do you present it just straight up and call it a job guarantee and say, here's the program? Or is it something that you might implement through stealth, for want for a better word? And I often think that the NDIS scheme has similarities to a job guarantee scheme. So there's a lot of people who have picked up good work in the care economy who are now earning more than the dole and are gainfully employed through this government initiative, which costs a lot of money, and so it should, and that's all terrific. But it's not called a job guarantee. Are we better off sneaking in programs like that until they reach such a sort of a critical mass that people are used to it, and then you can sort of say, oh, these are all job guarantee stuff? Or do you hammer the job guarantee framework itself?
I think both. Sure, you start talking about employment programs and job creation programs and introducing this novel concept of governments creating work for people. There have been successful programs, like in Victoria, we've seen a few very modest job creation programs. And yeah, I mean, it's good to encourage those programs. And it's good to say, like, this is great work that the government's doing. We want more of those. And, to have the gentle touch if you're one of those people inside the tent. But I don't think that on its own is going to do it. You need that combined with the more militant, radical approach outside the tent, which is hammering people on the big issue and saying that this is what we want, and creating that energy that we saw with the Green New Deal in America with Bernie Sanders and Stephanie Kelt. We've got a lot of resources we can draw from to create that enthusiasm and that militancy. And whether the people inside the tent support that or not doesn't really matter. The fact is that it's both heading in the same direction. It's both widening the political possibility for governments to do something about unemployment. And as long as it does that, that's a tick in my book, and it should be something that everyone welcomes.
So changing the narrative outside so that they can change the narrative inside a little easier. This is one of the issues that the Labor Party have, is that they seem reluctant to change the narrative. They seem trapped into dancing to the neoliberal tune. And so I guess what you're saying is that if there's people outside pressuring them, little things happening on the inside, then that's how we create change, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. And I think it's convenient in a way for people just to blame Labor. It's very easy to do, and as fun as it is, I don't think it really gets to the heart of it, because Labor has become what it's become because of what's happening outside the tent, and because of what happened inside the tent, and has created this monster, this austerity monster, because there is no meaningfully strong movement pushing for full employment. They could do it with little consequence. The unions who, as we know, they control 50% of the vote at Labor conferences. They could have put their foot down and said, we're not going to accept this. The Accord was a good example where the Accord, it had a lot of nice things to say about full employment, but didn't do anything about it. At any point during that, the unions got to put their foot down and said, this is a deal breaker for us. There were always opportunities along the line where sort of civil societies and the unions could have put enormous pressure on Labor to take a stronger line on this, but they didn't. So I think we need to sure critique Labor, but look in the mirror. Well, what have we created, and how can we start shifting, the political narrative, and that, I guess, what you call the Overton window. Try to shift that drastically towards genuine full employment, because ultimately the Overton window is very, very far away from that, I think, right now.
Mm-hmm.
I was interested to read in this Bill and Warren's Excellent Adventure. Bill was talking about how he's discussing this with Tony Abbott at one stage, and Tony Abbott seemed to have had an open ear to it. He was quite interested in the job guarantee as a concept, and he saw that it could also rile Labor, because they'd be pinching a policy that would be more for Labor was shelved. But if you've got someone as conservative as Abbott with an open ear to this program, surely there must be people in the Labor movement would be giving it a go as well.
Yeah, well, I've heard there's a lot of closet full employment people in the Labor Party, but they sort of stay in the closet because they think it's politically unfeasible for them to go out and start making a big song and dance about it. So, the Labor Party formally likes the idea of full employment, but all the people in the Labor Party are sort of chastened, and they don't feel like they can be open about it because they're probably going to break the caucus solidarity or whatever. So whether or not the Labor Party is going to be the vehicle to push this, I'm not sure, but what's clear is that there has to be a genuine social mass-based movement pushing for it, otherwise nothing's going to happen.
Well, Owen, I really like your inclusive approach to creating a movement behind full employment. And before we let you go, I'm just wondering, so if anyone's interested in getting involved at the very beginnings of an outside-the-tent movement for full employment, contact radiommt@gmail.com, radiommt@gmail.com, and if you're particularly wanting to speak with Owen, we'll pass your details on to him.
And I should also say that we've got the Unionists for Job Guarantee Facebook page and Twitter, so people who are interested can also have a look at it. But yeah, we're working on trying to build that up and hopefully start doing some public events next year.
Very early days, so it's very exciting times. Well, thank you again, Owen, for your time.
Thanks, Anne. Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, good on you.
Love your work.
Thank you. I was surprised to hear you say that you'd been reading in the latest book that's been written by two of the founders of modern monetary theory, Bill Mitchell and Warren Mosler, and that book is called Modern Monetary Theory, Bill and Warren's Excellent Adventure. Now, you mentioned that there was this scenario in which Tony Abbott, who is one of these arch-liberal politicians and past Prime Minister of Australia, you said at one point he was interested in the idea of a job guarantee, and that alone would put me off a job guarantee.
So interesting thing about Tony Abbott is that he's from a Jesuit school in Sydney. And the Jesuits are a very socially minded mob. I've heard a Jesuit describe Jesus as the first socialist. So being of this kind of Jesuit Catholic background, Tony Abbott did have this drummed into him, a kind of idea of social responsibility. The way he's chosen to explore that is a little unfortunate. But if Bill Mitchell came up to Tony Abbott and said that there's a better way of handling unemployment, he must have been digging back into his Jesuit ethos.
Oh, you think so? That's how you explain it. Wasn't that he just wanted to have a go at Labor and wedge them on the issue?
Well, I think he saw the opportunity to wedge Labor at the same time. But look, seriously, if there was a political discussion about wedging Labor that involved who's going to do the job guarantee better, that would be a very good conversation and good bit of politicking to be indulged in, I reckon.
I'd be very happy to report on that one. Yeah, so Owen mentioned this article by Michael Hiscox, and that article was titled "The Job Guarantee: Weakening Worker Power?" And that was published back in August 22, 2020 in Challenge magazine, the magazine of the left of the Australian Labor Party. I think this article is one of the more astute criticisms of MMT that I've come across. I mean, a lot of his criticisms are easily countered. But I do think there is that issue that we do need to face up to, which is the fact that a job guarantee, I see it as designed to allow the state to mediate between the demands of capital and labour. And so people like Michael Hiscox are saying, well, the job guarantee is going to undermine worker bargaining power. But I kind of think it really does strengthen the power of labour compared especially to where it is these days, even at the same time that it's dampening the ability of labour to set off a wage price spiral. And the way it does this is explained by Bill Mitchell and Thomas Farsi in an article titled For MMT, which was published in the Tribune, a British socialist magazine, back on the 5th of June 2019. And they are saying that redistributing labour from the inflating sector to the fixed price sector would ensure price stability and avoid costly mass unemployment. And of course, what Michael Hiscox doesn't like about that is that what you're essentially doing is the government spending less so that employers are employing less people, and those people are being basically shed from the private sector into a job guarantee pool. And then they'll be earning less money in the job guarantee pool.
Earning less money in the job. Well, yes. So I guess if you're on a job guarantee and you have a falling out with your work conditions, I'm wondering what sort of ability you have to negotiate your work conditions in a job guarantee.
Well, you don't. That's exactly what Michael Hiscox doesn't like, that you can't negotiate your wages or conditions.
So there would need to be structure set up around that. There would need to be regulations. I mean, it's the same thing as if you're on unemployment benefits at the moment. If you have a falling out with a department and you're on the dole, you've got very little recourse.
It's impossible. Yeah. So Michael Hiscox, he's putting it into the rights kind of framing and saying, why do job guarantee workers have less rights than other workers? And again, I think it comes back to the fact that we're talking about a hybrid kind of program that's part job and part social security payment.
Okay, so he might be correct, but I don't think it's a roadblock to the scheme. It's still a better idea than what we've got at the moment. Again, compare it to the status quo, which is you've got people on the dole living at half the poverty line who live in this brutal regime of being told to jump through these useless hoops or else. That's where we're at the moment.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. So Michael Hiscox is saying we also already have people working in childcare centres, hospitals and schools. We simply need to increase the number of positions available. And of course we would...
Correct.
we would agree with that.
Yeah.
And so why should they be given fewer rights? This is because they are working in an unskilled, more of a contingent position. And again, the devil is in the details on this, but I would say it's not shit jobs, it's shit wages, as some of the critics say. So, Michael, I'm just going to give you an example of what a job guarantee job might look like. And this comes from my personal experience, because over the past few years, I've spent a fair amount of time at a nursing home visiting an elderly relative. And the sorts of things that I do there, I imagine that would be exactly what a job guarantee person might be doing. So, of course, I'm not medically trained. I don't have support worker training. I do not bathe, medicate, or take urine samples from this person. I do not do their laundry. I do not make their bed. I do not organise group activities for them to go on. I do not cook their meals, and I do not monitor their sleep patterns. All of that is done by paid staff. But what I do is I will bring in some takeaway food and sit and have lunch and a chat with this person, and I will replace the batteries in their TV remote when they think the TV is not working. I will replug the electric reclining chair back into the socket when it's been pulled out of the wall. I will bring in extras, like when they request a notepad that fits into their pocket, or I'll bring in their favourite snacks, or I'll replace the empty box of tissues from the in-house store. I'll wipe off the food debris that builds up on their wheelchair, and I will wipe the drink spills off the legs of the table. They always wipe the table, but they never wipe the legs of the table.
Wipe the legs.
And I'll fish out all the small objects that have fallen behind the desk. And of course, most importantly, what I do is I give time for this person to voice their preferences. This person with onset dementia gets to express their preferences and to be heard. And I can tell you, Michael, there is no make work here. There is no work for the dole here. There's no workfare here. But I can imagine that every single person in that nursing home could do with this extra kind of care. And I would say only about 20% of them are getting it at the moment.
Yeah. What you say is you enable this person to be respected as a human being and have proper human interaction from somebody who has the time.
That's right.
And that's important. And it can be done. The resources are there. The need is there.
Yeah. Then all we have to do is get the money to put them together. And I looked up some of the numbers on this, Kevin.
Yep.
I saw that in 2023, there were 185,000 people in permanent residential aged care in Australia.
So there's no reason why you couldn't provide quite a lot of service there.
So we're literally talking about thousands and thousands of opportunities to make a positive contribution. And even though not everyone will be suited to this kind of work, I figure that about $45,000 a year equivalent full-time would be a fair wage. And
50. We're going for 50 now. We've had an inflationary episode and everything's gone up. I used to be 45,000, now I'm at 50,000.
You're a 50,000 job guaranteer.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So the point is that you can see a clear delineation between what someone in a career in aged care would be doing and what someone on a job guarantee would be doing. But you can also see what we've talked about before on this show, that if I was interested in a career in aged care, this would be a really excellent place to start.
Yeah. And then, of course, all of these 260,000 people are now earning good money, which they're going to spend. And that's going to stimulate the rest of the economy. A lot of people have got more money in their pocket. Is that going to be inflationary? Well, only if the things that they want are in short supply. But if it means that they can buy some more tyres for their car because they've been driving around on baldies for way too long and the tyres are available, it means that tyre manufacturers are going to be doing good business. That's good for the economy. And this whole argument of the quantity theory of money, saying that if you put too much money in the economy, it's going to push the price of everything up. That's been debunked by us 1,000 times. We're not going to go down that path again. It's rubbish. What we need to remember is that money is a social invention. And people think that money is this kind of natural thing. It's not. We made it up. If there weren't human beings, there'd be no money. We made it up. Its purpose is to mobilise resources, primarily by the government. We're using the government's currency. That means that anybody who is willing to contribute to society has the right to a slice of that money, which is a human invention. And if that can be done to mobilise resources to make it a better world to live in, that's all good.
Yeah. Well, I sort of see that full employment within planetary boundaries. That's the big goal here.
Yeah.
And my hope is that anyone working towards this goal is going to recognise their fellow travellers and work to support each other. So whether you're a Green New Deal activist or a donut economic activist or a public money activist or a job guarantee activist or an eco-socialist.
Or a communist.
One of those bloody commies. I reckon the message is that we should just stop being fatalistic about unemployment, and our reclaimed history shows us that it's possible to have full employment in a decent wellbeing economy in Australia.
Hurrah. Or should I say, huzzah. That sounds like a lovely place to end the show, Anne.
I think it might well be. So I'll see you again, I guess, in a couple of weeks.
Catch you then. Bye.
Bye. You've been listening to Radio MMT with Anne and Kev.
We'd love your feedback. Email us on radiommt@gmail.com or search Radio MMT on social media.
Listen to this show anytime wherever you get your podcasts or on 3cr.org.au/Radio MMT.
Support this show and the station by subscribing to 3cr.org.au and mention Radio MMT.
We thank all our guests.
And we thank economist Professor Bill Mitchell and his mmted.org, educating the masses on modern monetary theory.
And thank you to our listeners for listening. And I thank you, Kevin.
And I thank you, Anne. So what's planned for next week?
Kevin, there is still so much to talk about. We've got to expose all this rotten economics.
Well, no, that's good, and I get it. Do you reckon we could use a bit more music?
Well, I made a list of all these terrible economic theories. Like, I've heard of the theory of comparative advantage, or the quantity theory of money, or the loanable funds theory.
Have you heard of a band called Single Gun Theory? Like, they're a really good band. I'm sure there's a whole range of, like, macroeconomic music that I could bring into the show.
Yeah, but we really need to do marginal productivity theory, not to mention the natural rate of unemployment and the money multiplier.
You've got a pretty good singing voice. I play bass. Bill, he plays guitar. I reckon we could form a macroeconomics band. Like, we could deliver this whole message by music.
Well, we could call the band the permanent income hypothesis, or the Ricardian equivalence, or rational
I
expectations.
think we're onto something here. We're trying to make macroeconomics more interesting to the masses. We're going to, like, form this band and sing it to them. And we're going to bring the economists in. We're going to get music.
You've been listening to a 3CR podcast produced in the studios of independent community radio station 3CR in Melbourne, Australia. For more information, go to allthews.3cr.org.au.